So moving on in this review packet, number 8 asks if a forest is fragmented, right? So it's kind of split up. So there's areas of forest and then there's areas where it was deforested. Um, Explain how the edge effect impacts species diversity and population size. So first, let's talk about this edge effect here. So the edge effect is a term that is used to describe an increase in biodiversity at the border between two different habitats. So here it seems as though we have a deciduous forest, right? And it's right at the border of what appears to be a grassland, right? So this is the edge of one habitat, right? The edge of the forest. And it's right next to the edge of this grassland. Now, usually, if this is naturally occurring, there's actually going to be a greater diversity right at this boundary. So, probably, a couple of meters into the forest and a couple of meters out into this grassland, oh, a couple kilometers maybe, where there's going to be a greater number of species, mostly because, right, there's a greater number of niches, right? There's organisms that can live in this edge and fulfill niches in the forest and in the grassland. So because there's a greater number of niches, there tends to be a greater number of species. However, if an edge effect is created artificially, so through habitat fragmentation due to deforestation or land development or something like that, the edge, right, this newly created edge that we destroyed, right, succession is going to occur because we cut down an ecosystem, right? We left bare soil because we removed everything else. The first things to colonize this area are generally going to be generalist species, right? Species that really don't care. They have a very wide fundamental niche. They can survive in a variety of conditions. And the issue with that is that they tend to outcompete the species that were there before, and they push native species farther and farther into the center of the forest. This can actually end up lowering biodiversity in the entire forest as a whole. And because the species that have just colonized the edge are generalist, they have a wide niche, they can survive a lot of different conditions, they tend to be very good competitors and they can push their way closer into the center of the forest, which can over time change the entire structure of the forest. So there is actually sort of like, let's call it a guide on what is a better and what is a worse way to kind of manage these fragmented habitats. If you're going to set up nature preserves in an area that has been deforested, how would you do that? Well, you're better off going with a larger area, right? If you can leave as much of an original ecosystem intact that's larger, good. Smaller areas are not as great because they can't support the same number of species. It is better to leave one large area intact rather than several smaller areas. And preferably, the perimeter should be as small as it can be, right? So you're better off having one large circle than having something like a square that has a lot of edge, right? This would allow a lot of generalist species to occupy the surrounding area and start making their way inward. If you're going to fragment a habitat, it is much better to have fragmented habitats closer together. So it's better to have nature preserves, areas where you didn't cut down the forest, being closer together, because then it decreases the amount of species that can colonize in between the forest. And if at all possible, build nature corridors. So this is actually very common in Chicago where we set up these nature corridors. If you follow the north branch of the Chicago River, you will find that it is an uninterrupted nature corridor, pretty much spanning the north side of the city all the way up into the suburbs. That connects to a couple of other trails. So the edge effect can be mitigated through proper best management practices of these ecosystems. To fill out the biome chart, I actually want to bring your attention to this website. So HHMI is actually a biotech company that makes these really cool, let's call them virtual labs. And one of them is like a biome viewer. And you can click on an area, it'll tell you what biome it is. For example, this thing in Nevada is a desert, right? And it'll show you a climatogram, so it'll show you the average rainfall and temperature monthly throughout the year. If you click on more, it'll take you to this giant sheet that'll give you even more information. You can click on wildlife and it'll actually break everything down for you. This is a really good way to kind of explore all the different biomes in the world and just try to find more information on them. This is a 3D globe projection of the planet, so you'll find it's a little bit weird to start tracking the equator because it is a real view of the planet. You can go all the way around and like go all the way up here and kind of see the boreal forest of Russia. So go to the website. The link is going to be in the description and on the post on Google Classroom. So just play around with this for a little bit and kind of see what's around. I think this is a really good way to actually fill out this chart and just get a spatial, geographic orientation of where different biomes are on the planet. So that's the website you should be using to fill out this chart. But for the sake of time, because this is stuff I feel we're very familiar with, I did fill out the chart for you. So if you want to pause the video here and be lazy and not use the HHMI website and fill out this chart and suffer my disappointment from a distance, you are welcome to do that now. But I'm going to go ahead and move on to other topics. So here, what climate patterns determine the type of biome an area will have? Well, let's remember that biomes are categorized by long-term temperature and rainfall patterns, right? So think about those climatographs we saw, right? The climate is kind of what defines what a biome will be. Now, climate is influenced by two things, right? So climate is affected by distance from the equator, right? The farther away from the equator you are, the less sunlight you get. Generally, the cooler you are away from the equator. So the climate is going to be different. So the biome is going to be different in that area, but also elevation. This is a general rule of thumb where a 100-meter increase in elevation is about the same as moving 1 degree away from the equator in terms of latitude. That's just a rule of thumb. This is why you can have tundras in what is essentially a rainforest, because if you go high enough on a mountain, you're going to get a slightly different biome because you have different temperatures. This is one that you could get from the video, and it glitched when I was filling this out. The only thing you won't find on the HHMI Biointeractive, because those are terrestrial biomes, is the coral reef. Now, there are coral reefs off the coast of many, many countries. The United States has a coral reef off the coast of Florida and much of our eastern edge. However, the largest remaining reef is the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia. So that's something that would be difficult to find in that in the HHMI Interactive of the globe. Let's take a look at environmental benefits of wetlands. It says list 2, but y'all know that there are so many more, right? Wetlands filter water. They slow down the flow of streams, which prevents flooding. They contain a lot of nutrients. They provide a habitat. They provide aesthetic and recreational activities for us. They filter groundwater. They do a lot. So wetlands are super, super important. They provide a lot of services to us, especially in water management, right? They naturally filter pollutants in a watershed. They slow down the flow of water in a watershed, which prevents flooding, or at least reduces the amount of flooding that is possible. So wetlands are super, super important to us. They're also pretty significant carbon sinks, except for the methane production in some of them, but that's a little technical. Let's move on. The 4 major life zones of a lake. So we're talking about lakes right now. Oceans, we'll get to a little bit later, but the names are different, but the general idea is the same. So let's look at the life zones of a lake. So the littoral zone is right at like the border where the water meets the land. And that's generally where you're going to see the highest biodiversity of any aquatic ecosystem is right at the edge where you have the mix of terrestrial species, aquatic species, amphibians. This zone is always going to have the highest amount of biodiversity. The limnetic zone is where you're going to get enough sunlight for photosynthesis. So the limnetic zone kind of continues as deep as light can penetrate. And this is where you're going to get a lot of your phytoplankton. You're going to have a whole bunch of fish there. The dissolved oxygen, right, of this layer is really high. And then you get to the profundal zone. The profundal zone is where light no longer penetrates through the water. So this is going to be a very cool section of the lake, and it's going to have very low amounts of dissolved oxygen. Oh, it's going to have very low amounts of dissolved oxygen. You won't find too much life there. And then eventually you get to the benthic zone, right? That's where you're going to get a lot of your invertebrates, right? The stuff that tends to live at the bottom of a lake. So that's really about it. That's the diagram. Those are the different life zones of a lake. Let's keep moving on. List 3 examples of biotic components of an ecosystem and 3 examples of abiotic components. Now, of course, there are many more. Biotic refers to the living components of an ecosystem. Remember, the definition of an ecosystem is where the biotic and abiotic components are considered, right? It's a big scale of research. So the biotic components of an ecosystem are all the animals, plants, protists, fungi, right? All the living things that interact with each other, all the symbiotic interactions, the mutualisms, commensalisms, parasitisms, competitions, right? Those are all the biotic factors of an ecosystem. The abiotic is stuff like the availability of nutrients in soil, right? Nutrients are abiotic when you're looking at calcium and iron and all of that stuff. The availability of light in an ecosystem, right? The temperature, the amount of rainfall, those are abiotic components that kind of work in an ecosystem.